Hi folks, tonight I'm going to read you Weeds out of Edna St. Vincent Millay's 1921 volume, 2nd April. Speaking of April, if I haven't said Happy National Poetry Month to you yet, well, Happy National Poetry Month. I'm celebrating by continuing to do these videos, posting a daily poem on my Facebook page, and working on my own poetry. Not as much as I would hope, but some. I think poetry is so important in a difficult time like the present pandemic, and I hope my work here is helping you to keep afloat just a little. I have a feeling this short poem is going to require a lot of botanical notes, so let's get right into it. Weeds by Edna St. Vincent Millay. White with daisies and red with sorrel, and empty, empty under the sky. Life is a quest and love a quarrel. Here is a place for me to lie. Daisies spring from damned seeds, and this red-hot fire that here I see is a worthless crop of crimson weeds, cursed by farmers thriftily. But here, unhated for an hour, the sorrel runs in ragged flame. The daisy stands, a bastard flower, like flowers that bear an honest name. And here awhile, where no wind brings the baying of a pack athirst, may sleep the sleep of blessed things, the blood too bright, the brow accursed. All right, that was Weeds from 2nd April. Assuming you already know what daisies are, there's really only one botanical reference here after all: sorrel. Sorrel is the name of several different plants belonging to the genus Rumex. It's sometimes cultivated as a garden herb or salad vegetable, but it's more commonly viewed as a weed, which really just means a plant growing where it's not wanted. There are a bunch of different varieties of sorrel, like Rumex acetosa, that's the common sorrel, which that's probably the best known. It's native to Europe, but has naturalized all over North America, so it's likely Millay would have encountered it at some point or another. I mean, seems a reasonable guess. As described in the poem, it has crimson stems, and leaves often become a deep crimson in autumn as well. I'll put a link to the Wikipedia page about common sorrel in the description. To me, I think it looks a little bit like Swiss chard or beet greens. Incidentally, Rumex is also the genus that dock belongs to, which is another plant that is edible but is often viewed as a weed. Like sorrel, daisies are another plant that are sometimes valued for their beauteous cut flowers in this case, but also often seen as a weed, growing by roadsides and whatnot. And I think that sort of brings us around to the theme of this poem. So you've probably already guessed that this poem isn't really talking about members of the plant kingdom, but about Millay herself, like most of her poems. The natural world is usually used as either reflection or counterpoint to the experiences of her life, as we'll continue to see as we read through her poetry. We've seen it already in poems like Journey and Elegy Before Death. As one scholarly paper I found suggests, weeds are a primary metaphor for Millay, who identifies with hardy, subversive, underappreciated plants. That's actually from a review by Leslie Wheeler from Washington and Lee University of an annotated volume of Millay's poems, and I'll link it in the description below. Hardy, subversive, and underappreciated. Those are some adjectives. Hardy is definitely true. She grew up in a working class, single parent family in rural Maine, was largely self-educated. She did have a high school education, but she really only went to Vassar thanks to a wealthy benefactor. And as I said in earlier videos, she pretty much had to go and take remedial classes in order to do that. She was always pinched for money, even after she was famed as a poet. She probably had what we consider to be Crohn's disease today. She had many struggles with her health. She also had some chronic pain issues later in life. Before the time she was 60, she'd buried one of her sisters, both of her parents, and her husband. And she was struggling with addiction, which she beat in the last year of her life, by all accounts. Somewhere in there, she managed to win the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry and delight people like me 100 years later. So I'd consider that to be pretty hardy. Subversive? Check. For one thing, she wrote candidly about relationships and sex from a woman's perspective in a time when that was not particularly common. The words we'd use to describe her sexual identities today, like bisexual or polyamorous, didn't really exist or weren't as commonly used in her lifetime, but she didn't let that stop her. She forged her own path nonetheless. She was known to pursue her lovers aggressively, and that was also uncommon for women of the time. Again, keep in mind she was born in 1892, and a lot of the poems we're talking about here were written in the late teens or the early 1920s. As for underappreciated, well, I've always thought so, certainly. Me, being 80% Millay, have an appreciation for her, but I certainly don't see that echoed everywhere. Especially in today's scholarship, I've more often seen her poetry demeaned as being either death-obsessed, sex-obsessed, overly sentimental, or insufficiently intellectual, whatever that means. Some of that maybe she was writing in a more Victorian or romantic sensibility when modernism was becoming a thing. Recall that T.S. Eliot's poem The Wasteland was published in 1922, which would have been the year after this volume, 2nd April, was published. Compared to the free verse and impenetrable metaphor of Eliot's masterwork, the rhymes and meter and natural imagery of this poem feel somewhat old-fashioned and maybe a little quaint. But let's also not forget her poetry evolved over time and as she grew older. If you look at the work in Mind the Harvest, which is her last volume of poetry, which was almost all written in the last year of her life, it's a lot more mature, all while still being unmistakably Millay. So it's clear to me that many of these criticisms come from people who haven't read much more than her famous poems like Renaissance, or A Few Figs, the stuff out of A Few Figs from Thistles. And on the whole, I tend to regard this criticism of her as founded in sexism and a sort of literary snobbery, honestly. So yeah, I can see the weeds metaphor, and I can see how in this poem she's finding kinship and peace with her own kind. I also want to say something about the line, the baying of a pack athirst, where this lot full of weeds that she's talking about becomes a respite from, excuse the pun, a sort of hounding. My interpretation of this line may be unconventional? Yes, that's a word. I see her in this verse as escaping the attentions of her many lovers. I don't know precisely when this poem was written, but if it's like many of the poems in 2nd April, it was probably written in the late 1910s or early 1920s when she was living in New York City, before or after attending Vassar. And, well, as I said earlier, she sometimes aggressively pursued people she was interested in. It was just as common for people to be smitten with her, and her to try to, with varying levels of diplomacy, get them to go away. There were many men in those days who thought they were going to marry her, and at that time, in that place, she did not really want to be married and chained down by conventional expectations. And more generally, I think it can refer to her desire to escape from all expectations, be those of her lovers, or that of her family, her publishers, her benefactors, or even her own gender. If this was written while she was in New York, that was definitely a time when she felt she had many commitments to live up to, and didn't quite have the time to tell all these people to get stuffed, as she would do more and more of later in life. Didn't quite have the fame, not the time, sorry. So that's what I have to say about weeds, way more than I expected to. Thanks for listening to this Daily Dose of Millay, and good night.